Since the beginning of my career as an academic, I've been interested in equality and equity in children's outcomes, in learning outcomes, behavioral outcomes, and health outcomes. This idea of the learning bar, it's really a metaphor for what's called in literature a socioeconomic gradient. And I really look at gradients not only as a good research tool, but also as a valuable tool for evaluation and reflection. A socioeconomic gradient depicts the relationship between some social outcome and socioeconomic status. Socioeconomic status is, theoretically, it's a measure of people's access to and control over wealth, prestige, and power. In practical terms, we talk about mothers and fathers' level of education, the mothers and fathers' occupation, in particular the prestige of their occupation, and finally family income. Other factors like whether you're living in a single or a two-parent family, ethnicity, or characteristics of the child are also important determinants of children's outcomes, but they're not part of what we call socioeconomic status. So all the gradient is then is a simple descriptive summary of the relationship between some social outcome and socioeconomic status. And it's best to see an example. This is an example from the PISA study, which is a large international study of students' academic achievement at age 15. It was conducted in a little over 30 countries in 2000 when we focused on reading, then again in 2003 when the focus was on mathematics, and then just recently, 2006, we had the PISA study on science achievement. I know that there are a few teachers in this room whose students actually did the PISA survey. So in this graph then, what I've got is this desired social outcome called reading achievement on the y-axis. And the measure of reading achievement in PISA has 5 levels, going from level 5 being the top level down to level 1. And they actually have 6 levels. They don't like to call it level 0, so we call it below level 1. And the measure is standardized to have a mean of 500 across all countries in the OECD and a standard deviation of 100. And if you can remember a little bit of your statistics, if you think of a standard deviation, plus or minus 1 standard deviation encompasses about 2/3 of everyone, plus or minus 2 standard deviations encompasses about 95% of everyone. So most students within the OECD then will fall between 300, which is 2 standard deviations below the mean, and 700, which is 2 standard deviations above the mean. On the x-axis, I've got this measure of socioeconomic status, which is a composite of mothers and fathers' education, mothers and fathers' occupation. And we don't have family income, so we use proxies for income. We ask children about possessions in the home, material possessions in the home, cultural possessions in the home, and so on. So that's the gradient then, and this line here, the red line, is what we call the learning bar, the socioeconomic gradient. Each one of those dots is represents one of 5,000 Canadian students who did this survey. In fact, we had 30,000. I just couldn't get that many dots on the graph. So you see a sample of 5,000 dots on the graph. And I want to draw your attention to a few things. One of them is that if you look at level 2, and this distinction between level 2 literacy and level 3 literacy is an important one, because children who don't get above level 2 generally they have a very difficult time going on into any kind of post-secondary. And students who don't get beyond level 1 typically have trouble finding jobs after high school. They're prone to dropping out of school, and so on. So those are 2 quite important thresholds. Oftentimes our stereotype is that the kids at level 2 and lower are all from poor families, from low socioeconomic status families. But you can see that vulnerability in that sense cuts right across the social class spectrum. There's lots of kids out here from very well-to-do families and yet still doing very poorly on their reading at age 15. We do have what are called resilient kids, kids from poor families, but doing quite well, but really not as many as you do over on the right-hand side of the graph. kids from well-to-do families. So that's the gradient. And the way I think about gradients is that if you look at any social outcome, in this case it's reading, but it can be children's scores when they enter elementary school or kindergarten. They can be health outcomes, whatever you like. But you look at that relationship and it really gives you an immediate picture of what the system looks like. I think of the goal of social policy then, or in this case educational policy, is to raise that bar up and to level it. Raising it up means everyone's doing better. Leveling it means that you have better, you have less disparities between kids from rich and poor families. So there's a little graph showing the idea. You might have a gradient sitting here and we want to raise it and level it. So socioeconomic gradients then can be described by their level, how high they are, their slope, whether they're a steep slope or a gradual slope, and also the strength of that relationship, the extent to which there are kids above and below the line. If I go back to this graph for a second, Canadian gradient is relatively flat compared with most other countries. In other words, we do a good job of achieving equity between kids from rich and poor families. However, we've got a lot of variation above and below the line. That has to do with the strength of the gradient. If I showed you Hong Kong's gradient graph, it would look just like the red line would be almost on top of ours, except they don't have nearly so many kids way down there at level 1, level 2. All right? They also don't have as many up at level 5. It's a tighter fit of the line in that sense. It's useful to think about how well Canadian children fare in their schooling outcomes. 20 years ago when I started in this business and I was working with the TIMS study, it was called SIMS then, Second International Mathematics Study, and then it became TIMS, the Third International Math and Science Study, and now it's still called TIMS, the Trends in International Math and Science Study. Canada did okay. We usually scored comparable to the US, and we're right in the middle of the pack with the OECD countries. When PISA came along, we actually did much better. We came second in reading and about fifth in science, sixth in math, maybe the other way around, in around fifth or sixth in math and science. And, but the big surprise was coming second in reading. We were right up there sitting squarely amongst the top 8 to 10 countries in the world. And there we are with our gradient sitting beside the overall gradient for the OECD. You can see that our gradient is higher than the average for OECD countries and quite a bit higher than the United States. And it's more level. Right? It's a more gradual slope. So in a sense, we've raised it up. To improve further, we've got to raise it up further and make it more level. One of the interesting things is that students in Canadian public schools have the same average scores as US students in private schools. They're comparable. The US students in public schools are about 30 points lower, or about 30% of a standard deviation lower than their private school students. But Canadian public school students are scoring at a par with US private school students. That said, there's still a lot of variation among the provinces. Again, when I started in this business, it used to be that you'd see Quebec at the top end, Ontario anchoring the bottom end. Usually the Atlantic provinces would hover in around Ontario, sometimes a little bit above, a little bit below from study to study. The 3 prairie provinces would be in between Quebec and Ontario, and BC would usually do fairly well, close to Quebec. And that pattern really hasn't changed much in 20 years. It's quite remarkable how steady that pattern is. There you see the Quebec gradient right on top. Alberta has been making great strides in recent times, I think largely owing to its affluence. And you see the other 3 prairie provinces sitting in among them. There's British Columbia in green. Ontario is the black line, and it's been moving up in recent times. Oh, sorry, Ontario is the white line on this graph. And there you see the 4 Atlantic provinces done in blue. hand in hand with socioeconomic gradients, when I go into a school district and I look at school performance, or I go to a country and I look at school performance, I look first of all at the gradients across a whole bunch of different outcomes and see how that plays itself out. But I also look at school profiles. A school profile is just like a gradient, except now the unit of analysis is schools, not students. So here we have a graph for Canada, and the little dots you see, the little gray dots, are individual schools. We had 1,117 schools participate in PISA in the year 2000, and that red line is the regression line, or the gradient through those school dots. And this is what I call a school profile. Now what's fun then is to take that school profile and color in certain dots. You can color in rural schools versus urban, for example. In Canada, kids in rural schools tend to be, on average, have lower socioeconomic status, and their scores are a little bit lower, but it's not a huge gap. Or you can look at public schools. Private schools, kids in private schools in Canada also score about 30 points higher than students in public schools. But that's before you control for socioeconomic status. Once you control for socioeconomic status, the differences basically disappear. In other words, there's nothing magic that the private schools are doing if you compare like schools with like schools. It's also useful to look across provinces, and that's what I'm going to show you in this next set of slides, which I'll run through fairly quickly. There's British Columbia. As you might expect, because it's a relatively affluent province, its dots are over on the right-hand side of the graph. But most of them are below the regression line. In other words, they're doing okay, but they're not doing that well, given their socioeconomic status. Here's Alberta, which is very affluent, and you can see its dots are way over on the right-hand side, and quite spread out, some of them above the line, some of them below the line. Saskatchewan is fairly well contained in the middle, and contrasting Saskatchewan with Manitoba is quite interesting, because you can see most of them are scoring about average. Their gradient is about the same in Manitoba as it is in Saskatchewan, but a much different profile in Manitoba. Do you see how spread out they are compared? I'll just go back to that one. A very different kind of profile, calling for quite different kinds of reforms. There's Ontario. Ontario's schools are on the right side of the graph and below the line, not doing especially well. That said, they have been moving up year by year as PISA has proceeded. And there's Quebec's schools. Quebec's socioeconomic status on average is well below that of Ontario, but a lot of its schools are doing very well. They're well above the regression line. And you can see that it's not just the affluent schools that are raising the gradient in Quebec. It's schools serving kids from really average socioeconomic backgrounds. Right? Now there's probably, there's undoubtedly a mix of private and public schools in that, and various, in Quebec you have to think about degrees of privatization, because there's various types of subsidization. And there's good old New Brunswick. New Brunswick had the lowest scores on PISA in the year 2000. You can see it there. We've got a number of schools with very low socioeconomic status, and among the schools of average socioeconomic status, they're not doing as well as they are in some other provinces. Prince Edward Island, that's like the contrast between Saskatchewan and Manitoba, really spread out, and you see the same thing, same difference if you compare Nova Scotia with Newfoundland. Nova Scotia's gradient is similar to that of Newfoundland, but not nearly as spread out. You see how spread out Newfoundland's schools are. So again, it requires much different kinds of school reforms. So socioeconomic gradients then, I think, are powerful evaluation tools for characterizing the performance of a school system. They cause us to think about how we might raise and level the learning bar. Thank you.